Good evening and welcome to this edition of Resource PNG. Glad you could join us for more information and updates. PNG is going through an economic boom, but you may be wondering what is hindering our progress. The Asian Development Bank has shed some light on this. Just recently, the ADB released a report called Country Diagnostic Studies, Papua New Guinea Critical Development Constraints. It analyzes what PNG has gone through, and it also gives suggestions on how to assist our current situation. We also have the Secretary for National Planning and Monitoring, Dr. Peter Cora, to give us the government's response to that report. So to start off tonight's program, let us have a look at ADB's principal economist of the Economic Analysis and Operations Support Division, Mr. Mohammed Ishan Khan. He'll tell us what their reasons are for coming up with this report.
I'll try to cover two aspects. One aspect is giving a bit of a background on the approach that we used for this study and why is it different from the approach that has been used for similar studies in the past. And the second part is basically a bit of an overview of ADB's Country Diagnostic Studies series. Firstly, as I mentioned, this is a new approach, what we've been calling as diagnostic approach to development planning. And it basically comes out from the disappointments of approaches which were termed as one-size-fits-all approaches, and the reference here being to the Washington Consensus. We are set of policy options, policy recommendations were considered to be essential for all the countries. But the experience showed that some of the countries who followed those very religiously didn't do as well as some of the countries who did not follow them as closely. Examples were Latin American countries, which implemented a lot of reforms which were included in Washington Consensus. So the countries, the experience, as I was mentioning, of Latin American countries was that a lot of these reforms were implemented and the results were fairly mixed. On the other hand, Southeast Asian countries, which have done very well in the last 2 or 3 decades, have not gone into these reforms as closely. They have implemented things here and there, but not necessarily in the manner that the Washington Consensus suggested. So what came out of the thinking, looking back, seeing how had the Washington Consensus and its recommendations performed, a few realizations came out. One was that not all countries are same. All countries have their own strengths, their own weaknesses. They're all unique in every way. So the policies and approaches that they should be following should also be tailor-made to their situation rather than be some standard list of things to do. Another realization was that all countries face constraints or the challenges, and not all challenges are of same magnitude, the same importance, and hence they need to be dealt with in a manner which is also typical of their situation. If a constraint is more binding, more critical, then it should be dealt with as soon as, it should be the immediate priority of the country's government. On the other hand, if a constraint is not so severe and it's not so immediate, it could wait, or its implementation or its overcoming it could wait till later. Yet another realization was that at times, not at times, in case of most countries, whether they are developed, whether they are developing, they don't have the resources to tackle all the challenges and all the constraints that they may face. And I don't mean just in terms of financial resources, but I mean also in terms of human resources and also in terms of the political will. So with this background, I'll just give a short introduction of the diagnostic approaches. And I take an example from our daily lives. You go to a doctor. The doctor does not necessarily give you a medicine without talking to you first. Doctor may run through several questions and try to figure out what is the real reason or what are the reasons for those symptoms. For example, if you go to a doctor and you complain of a headache, it could be because of many reasons, and just giving you, asking you to take aspirin may not be the solution. It could be because of a common cold. It could be head congestion. It could be something more serious. It could be, you know, a head tumor. They could all give you the same symptoms. I was looking up earlier this afternoon at headache, and I found out there are 200 different kinds of headaches. So aspirin might work for some, may not work for others.
That was the first part of ADB's principal economist, Mr. Khan's presentation. Stay tuned for more of Resource PNG after these messages.
Substructure for the jetty are close.
Welcome back. You're watching Resource PNG. Let us continue with the Asian Development Bank's chief economist, Mr. Khan's presentation.
When doctor is running through that diagnosis, he would be looking at what is causing it and how to go about treating it. Just another basically illustration of some of 200 reasons for headaches. So after the doctor has had a chat with one of us, with the patient, trying to find out what might be the likely causes, he might prescribe a number of tests to find out, to gather evidence on what course to proceed with. And now, the second point, and as I mentioned earlier about some constraints being more important than others, there might be several reasons, several things that the doctor find may be wrong with the patient. Some of the things that I have listed here, and clearly some of those are more important than others. So what should doctor be doing? Should the doctor treat all of those at the same time? Or for example, first attend to a bullet wound which might lead you to death in the next couple of hours. So in the same manner, bringing that approach back to the Washington Consensus and development planning, if a doctor was to apply Washington Consensus, he would be trying to treat everything at the same time, and probably the list would be much longer because it did not come through a thorough diagnostic. So how does it apply to the development planning? Again, it's basically a three-step process. First of all, trying to figure out what are the different constraints that a country faces, what are the underlying reasons. Remember, constraints are just the symptoms like a headache, but what are the underlying reason for that? And then doing a prioritization of these constraints or challenges and trying to figure out what's more critical, what is the bullet wound for an economy, what's bleeding it dry, what should be addressed first, and what is the common cold which could be left for later. And then finally, trying to figure out what would be the policy, what should be the policy direction that the country should be taking in trying to overcome those challenges and constraints. Now, in terms of diagnostics, like when you flip through this report, you might think, oh, there's nothing new in here. Very rarely do the diagnostics bring out new areas which have not been, a common knowledge. Sometimes they do. Same as going to the doctor. At times you might discover something that you didn't know before. But it's more trying to understand what's behind that symptom and which challenge or which symptom is more important and needs to be addressed first. That's what's the key point that I would want to make here. And what do we diagnose through this study? We look at the inclusive growth and try to see what are the constraints to inclusive growth in a particular country. And I'm throwing up the framework that ADB has adopted for inclusive growth. Basically has three pillars. First pillar on maximizing economic opportunities. In other words, we need high growth, growth that generates employment opportunities, that generates investment opportunities, etc. Second one is ensuring that the population has equal access to those opportunities. And this may require several sub-components. It may require investment in improving capabilities, in other words, providing access to schools, or should I say equal access to schools. It should provide equal access to health, providing equal access to social services. But it also includes ensuring equal access to infrastructure that perhaps links you to the markets, to productive assets, for example, microfinance, land to grow crops if agriculture is as important in the economy as perhaps in case of PNG. And third one is ensuring minimum economic well-being, because in a society there will always be people who may not be in a position to tap in, to benefit from the opportunities. They might be old, they might be disabled, and whatnot. So ensuring some sort of a social safety net. And all of that has to be underpinned by good governance and environmental sustainability.
We'll take a short break, and when we return, we shall have an analysis of PNG's development constraints.
Economic change, and this would from the PNG.
Thank you for staying with us. We're featuring an analysis by the Asian Development Bank on PNG's growth. Here is ADB's country economist, Aaron Batten, with his presentation of PNG's development constraints, 10 lessons from a decade of growth.
Okay, thanks a lot for that, Hassan, for giving us an overview of what the growth constraints framework is. The topic of my presentation today is going to be what results we found when we applied this framework that Hassan outlined to the PNG economy, and then to really try and think about the experiences of the last decade, which has recorded an unprecedented level of economic growth for PNG, and try and uncover what lessons we can learn that have taken place over this decade that can help us in trying to think about making this next decade of economic growth more inclusive based on the definition that Hassan gave us. To begin though, I'd just like to give a short overview of exactly where PNG is at the moment in terms of its economy and where it's come from since independence. Broadly speaking, you can classify PNG's economic history into 5 main periods so far. The first was the early post-independence period, where you had a very slow but steady increase in output. The economy was relatively well shielded from large exogenous shocks in the international economy, and output grows steadily, but with quite substantial population growth, incomes remained relatively flat. This period of relative stability, though, was brought to an abrupt halt at the late 1980s when the Bougainville crisis occurred, and the largest mine in the country out at Panguna shut down, and the government lost about 25 to 30% of its revenue. And this induced a major economic crisis for the country and led, as you can see by the blue line on the top, to quite a significant drop-off in per capita incomes for the country. Following on from this, we then saw a huge boom period. We saw a number of new mines opening up, which more than replaced for Panguna, and we saw high international commodity prices leading to this dramatic increase that you see here in the third sort of slot there, massive increase in per capita incomes. Leading into the 1990s though, and we saw this all come to a crumbling halt. A drop in international commodity prices, reckless government spending, and some unconventional macroeconomic policies led to what has been termed the lost decade for PNG. It was very unstable, GDP growth rates fluctuated a lot, and overall per capita incomes declined. Jumping forward another decade, however, to today, and we see that this trend has now been almost completely reversed. We've had a 10-year period of macroeconomic stability, large rates of GDP growth, rising per capita incomes, and over this period we've actually seen more than a doubling of private sector employment, and this has essentially recovered all of the lost gains that were made from the 1990s. Looking forward again as well, and what we sense now is this growing sense of optimism around the PNG economy. LNG, as combined with a number of other mining investments, will lead to a huge boost in GDP growth again, looking forward. But the problem with this macroeconomic story is that it sort of overplays a growing sense of unease in PNG about rising levels of inequality and the actual benefits that people are getting from this economic growth and macroeconomic stability. We've seen, adding to this sense of unease really is a growing sense of inequality in the country. Some people are seemingly able to capture large amounts of wealth from this economic growth, whilst the rest of the population seems destined to face the consequences of growth with rapidly rising prices and inaccessible job opportunities. Combining with this and really reducing the quality of life in the rural areas has been this perception of declining levels of service delivery, particularly out in the rural and remote areas of the country. And this has been compounding this sense of unease in PNG about why this economic growth is not benefiting people. So the question which this report really asks is, well, why isn't this economic growth benefiting PNG like it is benefiting other countries in the region that have recorded similar levels of growth and prosperity? And to do this, as Hassan outlined, the growth diagnostics framework takes a problem tree approach to diagnosing which of these constraints that the PNG economy faces are the most binding, is the terminology that they use. And I won't go through all of these things explicitly, and I'll leave you to read the report for the very detailed recommendations around each one. But I will just quickly outline the three areas within this sort of problem tree which were identified in the report as restricting the ability of Papua New Guineans to engage in the formal private sector and generate income earning opportunities. The first of these relates to PNG's low levels of human capital, resulting from what is a very unequal access to education and health services, and preventing really the country from being able to take full advantage of the opportunities which is now being presented with in terms of its economic growth. Secondly, it identifies the poor state of national infrastructure as a major constraint on the returns earned by private investment, and this is in particular hiding the role of weak transport and electricity in reducing the market connectivity for people to access income earning opportunities and reducing the investment returns for business. Finally, it highlights the risk created as a result of weak government systems, and in specifically refers to the role of weak property rights, weak taxation collection, and weaknesses in public financial management that are really undermining the ability of public and private investments to generate welfare improvements for the PNG population. Now, as Hassan mentioned, for nearly all of us in this room, these development constraints are by no means new or particularly interesting, given that they've been discussed so widely in PNG. But in my mind, they're interesting for two reasons. Firstly, they tell us what we don't think are the major constraints to inclusive economic growth in PNG. And here we see all of the other factors that are in play. So PNG actually has quite good levels of domestic savings. It has quite a good financial intermediation system. The market failures in their economy are actually quite weak, where you have quite good price discovery signals and you have people operating in quite an efficient manner when they're allowed to. And also, the macro risks that are established in a lot of other countries don't exist in PNG. There's been this broad sense of macro stability with stable financial policies and monetary and fiscal settings. So what this allows us to do is to prioritise this grouping of issues, which I've broadly classified here as service delivery. And what I want to spend the next part of my presentation on is to really sort of delve into what lessons can we learn from this last decade of growth that might teach us how we might go about addressing the constraints on improving this service delivery, given that it is the key diagnostic constraint on PNG's inclusive growth. So, lesson number one, and I feel this is a very appropriate lecture to give in university, so just bear with me if you think I'm being a bit of a lecturer here. The first lesson over the last decade is that government funding actually has a very weak relationship with the level of service delivery that you see across PNG's provinces. And what this chart shows firstly is the red line, and this is a line calculated by PNG's National Economic and Fiscal Commission, And this tells you how much funding each province receives in terms of what is actually needed to deliver what they term as a basic set of services. So we see this huge variation across provinces, right down from Sundown to the left, which receives about 50% of what is said it needs to deliver services, right up to Western Province, which receives more than 200% of what it needs to deliver basic services. If we compare that against this bar chart in the grey here, which shows the Human Development Index outcomes by province, what we actually see is that those provinces that record the best human development outcomes actually have no relationship to the amount of funding that they receive from the government. And this is a very important issue. In contrast, we see that those provinces that actually record the worst human development outcomes tend to be on the high spectrum of government funding. So the more government funding provinces tend to get, the worse they tend to perform in service delivery. Now, thinking about that in terms of how we think about improving service delivery into the future, particularly at this provincial level, is important for a couple of reasons again. Firstly, it highlights that significant progress can be made at the provincial level within existing funding constraints. You know, there's a lot more efficiency being generated in places like Manus and in Eastern New Britain and New Ireland than there is in places like Southern Highlands and Enga and Morobe. So making better use of the funds that already are given to these provincial governments is an essential part of improving service delivery. The second point that it points out is that really until improvements in the quality of public financial management are made at the provincial level, dramatically increasing spending at the provincial level is unlikely to lead to better service delivery. It's the quality of the institutions at the provincial level that matter for service delivery. It's not the amount of funding that they're getting from the government. And this should really prioritise how we think at this provincial level of how we pressure the government to improve service delivery.
That was ADB's country economist Aaron Batten. We'll have more on that presentation after the break. We're looking at PNG's development constraints, 10 lessons from a decade of growth. Here is the Asian Development Bank's country economist, Aaron Batten.
The second lesson from the last decade is that better services don't always require, again, more government money. A resounding experience for PNG over the last decade is that huge improvements in both the cost and the quality of service delivery can be achieved by reducing rather than increasing government involvement in a sector. The most obvious of these reforms, as we all know, was the removal of the state monopoly in telecommunications and then the subsequent entrance of Digicel into the PNG market back in 2006. This reform has without doubt created the largest single impact on PNG's development performance over the last decade, and it was achieved without 1 cent of additional government spending. We've seen dramatic improvements in the coverage, reliability and cost of mobile phone services. And by removing their state monopoly, the government has allowed Digicel to create now 30,000 jobs for the people of PNG to service the 2.5 million users that now use mobile phones on a regular basis. Structural reforms that have reduced government involvement in other sectors have also been very successful over the last decade, particularly in the financial services and aviation sectors. We've seen corporations like Bank of South Pacific, which 10 years ago were on the verge of bankruptcy when it used to be the PNG Banking Corporation. And they've now been able to expand their services both across the country and internationally, bringing down cost of finance. And also we've seen airline freight and passenger costs drop by up to 40% on routes where there's been increased competition. So underlying all these messages about the sort of structural reform side of service delivery is a very simple principle that can guide future development strategies. And that's by promoting policies which aim to promote competition, the government can enable the private sector to deliver goods and services at a cheap cost to even the most remote locations in PNG. I know you can get Digicel reception on the top of Mount Wilhelm now, and that's an area which the government has yet been able to reach in terms of its own service delivery. So the capacity of the private sector to deliver is huge, and allowing them to do that has a lot of big advantages for us. The third major lesson for the last decade is that the PNG economy, probably in contrast to a lot of people's thinking, is no longer dominated by just mining and agriculture. And traditionally, both mining and agriculture have comprised the largest portion of the PNG economy. And during that time, the services sector, which has traditionally been very big in other economies, has remained small. It's just provided services to these other sectors, such as transport, finance, and logistics. But over the last decade, this pattern has begun to change dramatically for PNG. And it's been PNG's services sector which has been recording the fastest rates of growth in the economy. And we can see that really in the first chart here on the left, which shows the variation in growth rates between mining, agriculture, and services. And what that shows is between 1995 and 2000, before the recent decade of economic growth started, services were contracting and there was remaining very small in the economy. But then once macroeconomic stability was restored and some microeconomic reforms taken place, the growth began to pick up. And again, it's picked up more in this most recent 5-year period. And this has led to a dramatic increase in the size of the services sector for PNG. And we see this in many industries and diversification taking place in areas such as telecommunications and financial services. And the major benefit for PNG's development in terms of that is that it's been this services sector growth, rather than agriculture and mining, that's been generating jobs for Papua New Guineans. We see on the right-hand chart here the level of job growth by services subsector, and we see across everything, transport, communications, finance, wholesale, retail trade, there's been huge increases in employment growth. And this is what's led to a rapid rise in PNG's formal private sector over recent years. And what this teaches us is that broadening our thinking of the PNG economy away from just agriculture and mining and trying to develop these other sectors of the economy that are more inclusive and generate more jobs for Papua New Guineans can have the biggest effects on improving the welfare of the people. Another sort of corresponding lesson that goes along with this services sector growth is that traditional business practices, Kastam as I refer to it here, are becoming much more compatible with modern international business, which is a very interesting trend in PNG. The first example of this is really the growing strength of a number of landowner companies that we've seen across the country over the last year. Now, PNG has a long history of very unsuccessful landowner companies. We've seen failed business ventures, extortion of money, and poor ability to transfer the wealth to the people that these landowner companies have been representing. But over the last decade, we've seen this quite unique transformation happening where we've seen a small number, but quite big landowner companies beginning to be commercially viable, not just in their own project areas of where they come from, but across the country and in some cases internationally. We now have some landowner companies competing in Solomon Islands and in Australia, operating at mining sites and competing with other big international firms. Another important trend to emerge over this last decade has been the growing cooperation that we've seen taking place at the smallholder farm level with medium-sized businesses. These farmers in coffee, cocoa, copra, palm oil are now actually starting to form their own industry groups that are becoming powerful players in the local economy. And they're providing themselves with the extension services that they need and the cooperatives that they need in order to cooperate and sell their goods internationally and domestically. And they're getting those agglomeration benefits by being bigger, but they're still maintaining their traditional small-scale farmer approach. And while still small-scale in nature, both of these trends are providing what is really a uniquely PNG response to the question of how you transfer this resource boom into broader jobs-generating growth for the economy. They're building management capacities at the rural areas, and they're linking remote parts of the country to domestic and international business opportunities. And it's a very positive trend that we've seen over this last decade. The fifth lesson that we've really learned over the last decade for PNG is that PNG as an economy is now showing itself to be increasingly capable of competing in and benefiting from the rapid growth that's taking place in Asia. As you can see from this line here, which tracks PNG's total exports to the Asian region as a whole since right back to independence, we've seen a dramatic transformation over the last decade. From 1976 up until around 2000, the level of exports to Asia remained relatively low. PNG was selling a small amount of mineral products and a very small amount of agricultural products to the region. But over the last decade, as you can see here, trade to the Asian region has been booming. And this isn't just about the mineral sector either. It's not just gold and copper being sold. PNG producers now sell oil palm and copra to Malaysia and the Philippines. They sell balsa, coffee and cocoa to Japan and China. And they sell tinned tuna and seafood to Indonesia and Hong Kong. And these are all activities that weren't taking place a decade ago in the PNG economy. In total, as you can see from the chart, PNG exports roughly 5 billion kina worth of goods to the Asian region today. And that's a 500% increase from a decade ago. Thinking towards the future, designing development strategies that really seek to leverage off PNG's growing strengths in the Asian region will play a big role in fostering more employment opportunities for Papua New Guineans, particularly in the rural areas where a lot of these products are made.
Stay with us. We shall have the last part of that presentation after these short messages.
The moment we're on track.
Welcome back. Let us continue with the final part of that presentation from the Asian Development Bank's country economist, Aaron Batten.
So that brings me to the sixth lesson of the last decade of growth. And that is also, for the first time since independence, PNG has an economy that is capable of providing more employment opportunities for the population. What this chart here is going to show you is the total number of people that are employed in the formal private sector since independence, and it goes up to 2005. And what this shows us is a very interesting but albeit worrying trend, and that was between independence and 2005, the PNG economy essentially generated very few new income earning opportunities in the formal sector for Papua New Guineans. It averaged about 150 to 175, and then if you add on to that public sector employment, it's probably up close to 200,000 people, which is a very small percentage of the population. And this was despite a number of mining booms and agricultural booms in the economy. We didn't see the employment generation that you'd like to see to improve development outcomes. But since 2005, again, however, we've seen this situation in PNG dramatically change. With PNG's new services sector growth, combining with both high commodity prices to lead to a doubling of the number of jobs in the economy in the space of little over 6 years, showing the potential of the PNG economy to create income earning opportunities if it is given the right opportunities to do that. And this trend also has a number of implications for how we foster more inclusive growth into the future. Firstly, it emphasises the need for growing investments in human capital through education and technical vocation programs so that the population is able to take advantage of these growing opportunities that the economy is presenting it with. Secondly, it really drills home the benefits of diversification in the economy. Fostering policies which aim to foster growth outside of PNG's traditional mining and agricultural sectors, with the major driver of this, as I mentioned, being coming from the services sector growth that we've seen over the last 5 to 6 years. On the same token, however, if we look at the same chart, again, showing total formal employment numbers for the PNG economy since independence, we learn a seventh lesson which is a lot less positive, and that is that rapid population growth is eroding a lot of the benefits that PNG is recording out of this massive boom in formal private sector employment. The recent census showed that over the last 10 years, PNG has recorded a population growth rate of 2.8% per annum. And to put that in perspective, an interesting number is that in 45 years' time, PNG will have the same population as what Australia has now, and by the end of the century, PNG will have a bigger population than Australia, to put that sort of rate of population growth in perspective. And so if we can put this sort of rapid population growth into this chart and see, well, how many people on a per capita basis are being employed in the formal private sector, we see a very different story for the PNG economy since independence. And the percentages are shown here on the right-hand side. And what we saw was that from independence up until 2005, a declining share of the PNG population were able to access the formal private sector and generate jobs and incomes for themselves. Since 2005, this has increased, but still, we're roughly, somewhere between 3 and 4% of the total population are able to get jobs in the formal private sector, which is very small. The most important lesson that this teaches us is that unless the process of economic diversification continues in PNG, the economy is unlikely to absorb enough people to the labour market to induce widespread development benefits. We're going to continue to see this very narrow proportion of the population engaged in the formal economy and benefiting from growth, while the rest of the population will suffer the consequences of that growth. In this regard, making further progress on the structural reform agenda, promoting competition and reducing the cost of doing business will be central components of a successful development strategy that alleviates the constraints on inclusive growth. And this brings us really to the 8th lesson of the last decade of economic growth. And that is that unrealistic perceptions of PNG's level of resource wealth can have a big role in distorting policy making and the demands that are placed on government. Now, as we all know, PNG has recorded dramatic increases in revenue over the last decade, and this has allowed the government to stabilise its finances and promote macroeconomic stability. But despite this massive increase in resource wealth, PNG still remains a highly resource-constrained economy. And in that sense, I mean, in terms of the amount of money that it has per person in the country, it's still very low. It has a very low amount of money to spend on service delivery. And that's what this chart here tries to illustrate. It shows on the left-hand axis here the amount of dollars per capita that each government listed here. So we have the Solomon Islands, Indonesia, PNG in the red, Thailand, Fiji, Tonga, Malaysia, and then Australia on the right-hand axis. And what we see here is that despite a decade of economic growth, a massive resource boom, very high commodity prices, PNG only just has a little bit more revenue per capita than the Solomon Islands and Indonesia, but is still significantly behind other sort of comparable countries in the region like Thailand, and significantly behind other Pacific countries like Fiji and Tonga. If we compare it to emerging tiger economies like Malaysia, we see they have more than double the funding per capita. And then on the right-hand scale, Australia has more than 20 times funding per capita of PNG. Now, again, there's a lot of optimism surrounding what role the LNG project will have on alleviating a lot of these constraints for PNG. And so what we can do is actually estimate, well, if we add on total LNG revenues to today's revenue, say from 2015, what we expect to be getting, what impact will have on this situation. So if we add on these 2015 revenues, this is what happens to total PNG government revenue. It's about 1.5 billion kina a year, which is about $100 per capita. Now, LNG revenues will increase rapidly over the lifespan of the project. So if we again ask the same question, okay, well, what will be the impact of peak LNG revenues, which are expected around 2030 sometime? And again, the impact of that again is very small. We have in total about $200 per capita, which is added to government revenue as a result of LNG. So once that comes online, you still see PNG is significantly behind where Fiji and Tonga are today, which brings home the challenges that the PNG government faces in trying to provide services to the population. And this fact is really useful for thinking about how we go about improving services for two reasons in my mind. Firstly, it highlights the need to bring more people into the formal private sector in PNG. At the moment, you have 5% of the population providing the resources for the government to provide service delivery to the other 95% of the population, given that the government only collects revenue from people that are in the formal sector. And this creates this huge challenge for the government. Secondly, it highlights the need to rein in public expectations about what the PNG state is actually able to finance on a sustainable basis. In particular, there's been a tendency that needs to be reduced in PNG to expand the range of services provided before making sure that existing services and assets are maintained, or that there's adequate financing to maintain those assets. And there's some very good examples of this, like building new buildings before you're maintaining existing ones properly, building new roads before you can provide the maintenance funding to make sure there's no potholes in the existing ones, and also to make sure that your existing health posts and schools are operating before you go out and build new ones. Adding on to this is the 9th lesson from the last decade that we can take away. And that is that new models of service delivery being trialled by the government and its development partners are actually offering a lot of advantages that perhaps weren't being fully appreciated a decade ago. In particular, over the last decade, we've seen the emergence of a number of innovative partnerships between the government and non-state service providers to improve rural service delivery in areas such as health and education. Now, in one sense, the involvement of the private sector in service delivery in PNG is not a particularly new concept. We've seen mining companies providing exclusive rights to the landowner groups that are around their areas of operations. But what makes this trend different today is that we're seeing that the private sector providers are now showing themselves willing and able to step outside of their project areas and partner with government and partner with development partners to deliver services to a wide range of people in very remote locations. Since 2002, we've seen 8 different provincial health authorities form partnerships with 6 very large private sector companies to rejuvenate and maintain over 100 rural health clinics across the country. And the evidence suggests that's coming back so far over the last decade is that these partnership approaches with the government, both with the private sector and with church groups, are leading to much better health and education outcomes than when they're just being delivered through standalone government systems, particularly in these rural and remote areas of the country. And this offers a very productive way forward in thinking about how we address service delivery in the future. So what's the final lesson of the last decade that we can draw out? And that is probably the most important one, that individuals will make the biggest difference to improving the level of service delivery in PNG over the next decade of growth. Over the last decade, PNG has fallen to the bottom 5% of the control of corruption index calculated by the World Bank, a trend which has widespread ramifications for all levels of service delivery across the country and in inducing positive government behaviour. And whilst the report really delves into a lot of issues around this, and there's no single solution to addressing issues of corruption and a lack of service delivery, one trend that is looking increasingly optimistic in the case of PNG is the use of social media to empower citizens not only to hold governments more accountable for their actions, which is one component of it, but also to enable governments to get a better handle on where they're succeeding in service delivery and where they're failing in service delivery, and to feed into their policy-making processes. And we're seeing a number of examples of this through PNG's social media. People in Lae and Port Moresby are posting Facebook messages every day on unfixed potholes. Forums such as Shark Talk and Act Now are providing people with opportunities to share information on important issues, whilst a growing number of people are writing very insightful blogs about the political and economic issues of the day. How this trend evolves in PNG over the next 10 years is a little bit uncertain as of yet, given how new it is. But many other developing countries are using this sort of technology in a very productive way. We see other countries using social media to crowdsource information on which health facilities are working, which schools have teachers that are turning up. And other governments are paying a lot of attention, particularly through Africa, into how this information can feed into policy-making processes and holding rural level service delivery agencies to account for their performance. For PNG, this type of really direct access seems a little way off, but with such a rapid rate of change in this area, there's a lot of hope that individuals will become the key players in improving the incentives for their government to provide a better quality of service delivery over the next decade. So what can we conclude from these 10 lessons? Well, to go back to the beginning, PNG has undertaken some dramatic transformations over the last decade, and no one can dispute that. Macroeconomic stability, high commodity prices and structural reforms have changed the patterns of PNG's growth, with mining, agriculture and services all growing in unison and creating a rapid surge in employment opportunities for the people of PNG. But this growth at its core remains highly unequal for the people. And the core constraints on making growth more equal has been really the declining quality of service delivery over the last decade. But this last decade also does give us some ideas for how we might improve this situation. Economic diversification is opening up a huge range of employment opportunities not seen before in PNG's history. New models of service delivery leveraging the capacity of the private sector are enabling growing segments of the population to receive services. Local landowner businesses are starting to commercialise, generating sustainable revenue streams and employment. And trade with Asia is expanding rapidly, opening up many new export opportunities for agricultural workers. Whilst new forms of social media offer the potential for improving accountability and transparency of government. The final point, though, is ultimately it will be how individuals, such as the young people that come out of the University of Papua New Guinea, use these types of tools that are now presented with them over the next decade to hold their governments to account and to demand better service delivery. That will determine whether the next decade of economic growth is more inclusive than the last. And with that, I'll hand it over to Peter Cora for a response. But thank you for your time.
Please stay with us. When we return, we'll have the response from the National Planning and Monitoring Secretary, Dr. Peter Cora.
Oil to be discovered, which we think is in
After hearing that analysis from the Asian Development Bank, we have the response from the Secretary for National Planning and Monitoring, Dr. Peter Cora, to give the government's feedback. I spoke to Dr. Cora a little earlier. Good evening, Dr. Cora.
Good evening, Eunice.
So to start us off, let's just discuss what is the job and the role of the National Planning and Monitoring Department?
The Department of National Planning and Monitoring is one of the central government departments. Its primary role is to develop development policies and strategies for the country. It also allocates resources for the country in terms of how much money will go into priority sectors. And also, one of the prime roles and responsibilities of the department is to coordinate development efforts by various players. One is the development partners of foreign development assistance, and also domestically we coordinate the work of all the line government departments like transport, education and health. So we all coordinate. The department coordinates the efforts of all these government agencies for development.
All right, so it seems the National Planning and Monitoring Department does a lot of coordinating. So it seems we've got something right since independence, because right now we've got an economic boom and somehow we've been able to attract all these mining and petroleum companies. So as a whole, what did PNG get right?
I think as a new country, like any other developing countries of the world, they go into the transition of doing trial and error things. They don't know where to go. So Papua New Guinea is no different. We have come a long way, trying our best to understand what sort of government system structure we should have, and how we should move. And therefore, we should not say that we could have done better in the last 20 years, because we were just a new state and we were progressing. So now we learn a lot of things that we could have done better. So at this stage now, we know what the problems are. So that's why we have the past governments and current government identify the problem areas for development. So you see in the development plans like medium-term plan, PNG development strategic plan, Vision 2050 and so forth. So all these things took into account of what are the current problems and challenges. So development is still progressing. We could not say that we could do better. We are still progressing. We got to learn our mistakes, and we try to address them and improve them.
On the 9th of May, when that report, the Asian Development Bank report, was launched in Port Moresby, you had stated that there was 5 provinces that were involved in a pilot program where you had the private sector and the public sector work together in terms of service delivery. Which are these? Who are these people? Who are these organizations, and which provinces have those pilot programs going?
We tie in water supply and sanitation. We tie in rural electrification and rural transportation. So those 3 important sectors, we are asking the PNG Water, we are asking the PNG Power and Telecommunication and the Works Department to put a package together. So we have all funded them, except for Works Department, just have to come and manage the particularly the equipment that we'll buy for the local level government council. Now those 5 provinces, provinces are Leh, Medang, Wanimo, Jimbu, and one in Central. Those are the 5 provinces we are looking at, but we will select the LLC, particular LLC in those provinces to test whether this can work.
Why those 5 provinces, though?
Basically, we try to get one from its region. We also thinking of getting Kokopo, but just to distribute among the regions. But something that is close to us so that we can manage well.
Papua New Guineans were tied to the land. Now, land and land titling was one of those critical constraints that were mentioned in that report. What's your take as a Secretary for National Planning and Monitoring? How should we, as Papua New Guineans, look at this, and how is the government trying to help to probably bring down this barrier?
Land issue is a very sensitive issue in this country. A lot of efforts have been put into it at various stages. We have land reform introduced by the IMF and World Bank under the Structural Adjustment Program. Then there were other initiatives, but recently the government, some years ago, I think 2 years ago, that it has passed a law to enable customary landowners to register their land. That registration of land allows them to use the land for commercial activities. They can lease the land for some kind of commercial activities.
So it's not actually selling their land, they're just registering it,
Yes.
but they're leasing it.
They're leasing
As a business.
As a business.
All right.
So the whole idea about this is that currently 97% of our land, those are customary land, still in customary, under customary title. Only 3% is the alienated land or title land, which most of them are kind of owned by the state. With this 3%, we cannot move this country forward. Because we need to open up our customary land and to allow for increased commercial activities. When we do that, a lot of companies coming on, foreign companies and domestic companies, leasing land and conducting business. There's increase in employment. They pay taxes to the government. Tax revenue is high, and all sorts of those good things. So the idea is to expand the use of customary land so that we grow our economy. And so it is good reasoning or a reason behind this. So we want to do it properly so that people are not missing out. People are happy about their land and benefit and improve their life. That's the basic thing. So we also want to protect our landowners. And so that's the whole idea. Like Papua New Guineans, the educated Papua New Guineans, we should think about, whilst thinking about protecting our culture and our land and heritage, we should also think about, progressing.
Yeah.
So we should not really give up in trying to get one thing and then forget about another thing. But we have to, strike a balance and move forward. That's the thinking behind this.
Thank you. Sounds like a work in progress.
Yeah.
We thank you very much for your time, and thank you for being on the show. We look forward maybe to another interview later on.
Thank you, Eunice, for the opportunity to come into your studio and to tell the nation about what this department is doing and what it intends to do to help the government to make a better plan for Papua New Guinea.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This ends another evening with Resource PNG. Thank you for joining us. Please remember that if you have any queries, do drop us an email on this email address, resourcepng@mtv.com.pg. Until next time, you have a pleasant evening.